Lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT.
And welcome back to the program today, Wednesday, September the 11th, 2024. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by the radiant, the very intelligent and astute, newly minted Central European correspondent for today's News Talk, the one and only Taylor Hudak. Welcome to the program, Taylor.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now then, political earthquake in Central Europe, of course, last week with the huge gains made by the AfD, Alternative for Germany, readily dismissed, of course, even by Chancellor Kohl and Merkel's Christian Democrats as far-right extremists. And yet it seems the so-called mainstream parties are desperate to steal their clothes, having realized that Germany's open-door immigration policy has been, well, if not a recipe the disaster, then not exactly resoundingly popular with the German electorate.
Exactly. I think it's very interesting because right now you are seeing somewhat of a shift in policy or shift in thinking with regard to migration into Europe, into the EU countries, and specifically within this Schengen zone. So you first mentioned Germany, and it's interesting to note here that starting on September 16th and then lasting for about 6 months, a new wave of tighter restrictions will be implemented throughout the entire country in Germany at the border. And this is to tackle specifically irregular immigration. It is being stated by the government that they are doing this in order to protect the country from extremism and also what they call Islamic extremism. Now, this, of course, comes after a terrible knife attack had happened in Solingen, in which I believe 3 people were unfortunately killed and several others were wounded. And this is just one of many knife attacks that has happened in Germany and all throughout Europe. But they've made this announcement. They are going to implement these new restrictions. And I do think that the timing here is quite interesting because, as you had mentioned, Basil, of course, the so-called far right, or I guess we can call them at least right-leaning parties like the AfD, and then also now too, Sarah Wagenknecht's alliance. I know she doesn't identify as being right-wing, but she is being referred to that often in the media. This alliance and this party, the AfD, have done quite well in recent elections, specifically in Thuringia, and forgive my pronunciation on that. And then the other one was in Saxony, I believe, just last week. And there's an upcoming election in Brandenburg. And I think that the Olaf Scholz Social Democratic government is a little bit concerned about maintaining control, perhaps, of these areas. And they realize that the migration issue is very important to the voters, and polls show that it's actually very important to those in Brandenburg who are facing an upcoming election. So I do see this perhaps change in tone with regard to migration to just be a way for the Olaf Scholz government to maintain control over the migration narrative and then to also maintain some favorability and their power within the government.
Friedrich Merz is the current leader of the Christian Democrats, and I believe he might take a turn as chancellor in place of Scholz in the German coalition. He's pledged not to work with the AfD, but surely there's going to come a time when German political parties have to work with them, because with major elections coming up in a year or two, they could even form the government nationally, which, considering that the neoliberal fascist parties have been trying to ban them, would be, a major earthquake, much bigger than the election of Meloni or the gains made by Le Pen recently.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also see the emergence of popularity of other so-called, again, far-right groups in other countries within the EU. And they actually created an alliance, a right-wing party alliance within the European Parliament just recently. And this includes, I believe, Hungary. I also think Netherlands, France, Germany, several other countries have formed this alliance because it does seem that people are becoming fed up, as you said, with these neoliberal policies and specifically with migration and this increase in migrants, asylum seekers, as well as the violence that they're seeing, which has been blamed on many of these migrants. But if you look back in 2022, I think that marks a significant point when things seem to get much worse, specifically in Germany, because they granted automatic asylum. They were very generous with this, granted automatic asylum to Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers. And in fact, these individuals were granted various privileges that were not granted to asylum seekers of other nationalities. They were given an extended visa-free stay, as well as free accommodation, free medical care, education, as well as a citizen's benefit, which turned out to be 563 euros a month. Of course, that's not, I guess, enough to live on. But when you have all these other free accommodations, I mean, they were being and are being very well taken care of in the country. However, recent reports just show that, in fact, and these are coming from the EU, these EU stats show that several 100,000 Ukrainian refugees have since lost their temporary protection status in Germany. The number is still quite high at 1 million Ukrainians seeking refuge in Germany, but it is a drop from the previous month by, they say, almost 250,000 asylum seekers. Now, there could be various reasons for this. One of them may be that these individuals left Germany or they have been recategorized, but it just goes to show that there seems to be some pushback perhaps against these very lax and open immigration policies, which, by the way, we're talking about it specifically here within the EU and the European countries, but this is a discussion that is happening globally. Also, very hot topic in America right now, specifically Ohio, Springfield, Ohio, where there has been a lot of discussion and grave concern about some very disturbing reports about Haitian immigrants killing people's house pets and eating them. I know that the Ohio, in that community, their governor or their mayor had stated that these reports are not true. However, reports on the ground from the people that live there state that it is true. But it just goes to show that mass migration, when not done properly, does cause mass disharmony, and it does not lead to harmony or peace.
Yeah, I mean, Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CDU, who until recently, of course, were 100% behind mass migration. Angela Merkel famously said, wir schaffen das. I think we can do this. Forgive my German not being up to scratch, but she insisted that Germany welcome what she called the new people with open arms, regardless of how they behave. But now Merz is saying that on average, there are 2 gang rapes per day in Germany. 2 gang rapes every day, far more than half of which are carried out by migrants. And that's the first time I've seen him put his finger on the nub of the issue. Migrants are to blame for the nightmare of gang rapes. And has claimed new arrivals to the country are largely responsible for almost daily cases of knife crime and sexual assault. Speaking on the campaign trail in Brandenburg, Merz accused young migrant men of a complete lack of respect for women. Who knew, Friedrich? Who knew? Little bit like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, isn't it, Taylor?
Yeah, it is. And, this topic, as I mentioned, is something that is very contentious. It can be somewhat controversial, and it does really divide a lot of people because it does pave the way for people to point at each other, call each other racist. So it is a tricky topic. It is interesting, and I think very good to see that this is finally being addressed. I hope that it sticks and it's not just being used for political purposes, as I suspect it may be the case in Germany, given that you had these elections where the far right parties or right-leaning parties like the AfD did so well. But you're exactly right. There's been a huge influx of asylum seekers, refugees. In fact, the number that I have in front of me right now is actually 1.12 million asylum seekers applied for asylum in the EU just in 2023. And this is the highest since 2016. And I think that there was an idea that after the so-called pandemic in 2020, that there would be a reduction in the amount of people who are seeking asylum in the EU, but that seems very much not to be the case. So I think that they're now left with no choice, they being the policymakers here and the government officials left with no choice but to do something about it. And when you look at Hungary, they are taking some quite drastic measures that have really upset Brussels and the Brussels bureaucrats. Once again, I feel like every time I'm on the program to speak with you, we're always discussing what is going on in Hungary, because it does have right now, and I think for the past several years, such a contentious relationship with the EU. because it is really seeking to fight back against some of the policies that it disagrees with, especially on migration, and things have heated up in particular as a Hungarian minister has announced that they plan to, again, they're stating that this has not happened yet, they haven't done it yet, and they're also not making threats, but they're warning that they can and they will, should they have to, they will ship irregular migrants coming from the Hungarian-Serbian border, that is the southern portion of the country, ship those migrants on a ticket free of charge voluntarily from Hungary to Brussels. And of course, this sparked quite a bit of outrage, as I expected it would.
The statistics in July released show that 761 cases of gang rape were reported to police in Germany last year, with a little under half of the suspects not having German citizenship. And I wonder how many were not born in Germany, but of the German citizens, that is, but acquired German citizenship subsequently, or indeed may have been born in Germany, but to parents that were not born in Germany. So we won't find that out, of course. Anyway, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, what about Hungary itself, Mr. Orban, the peacemaker, if only he's got his work cut out with the situation in Ukraine as it is right now. We'll be right back.
If you're still wearing a cloth or surgical mask around in public, you're guilty of spreading COVID misinformation. It really is that simple. We're today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to the Basil Valentine Show with me, Basil Valentine. Today, Wednesday, the 11th of September. Viktor Orban has vowed retaliation for a 200 million euro fine imposed by the European Court of Justice, of which Hungary is refusing to pay. And in retaliation, he's threatening to bus dozens, if not hundreds of migrants to Brussels. This is sort of simultaneously hilarious and also deeply troubling, isn't it? But indicative of the very deep fissures that exist between the leader of Hungary, where you are, of course, Taylor, in Budapest, and the dyed-in-the-wool globalists in Brussels.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like there's so much to talk about when it comes to the relationship between Hungary, of course, an EU country, also a part of the Schengen Zone, and the Brussels bureaucrats. And we're seeing that right now recently with this immigration policy. Hungary has been having sort of a contentious relationship with the EU establishment for its migration policy for some time. And this recent dispute, I believe, does date back actually to December of 2020. This recent dispute can be tracked back to December of 2020, in which Hungary had a ruling made against it by the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, stating that its asylum-seeking procedures were unlawful, incompatible with EU laws, and Hungary ignored this ruling. And then just of June of this year, Hungary was fined a lump sum of 200 million euros and then is being fined 1 million euros a day that it does not revise its policy in alignment with the official EU policy. So this busing idea or proposal that has been put forth by Budapest is seen as sort of a retaliation for these fines and for the restrictions that are being placed on Budapest. There's also been some complaints by the Orban government and other various officials in Hungary that they have not been adequately compensated to protect their borders, specifically the Hungarian-Serbian border. I believe that might be the most problematic one when it comes to irregular migration. And of course, I did see some Brussels bureaucrats, EU MPs coming forward and saying that this was abusive to ship these individuals, these migrants from Hungary to Brussels. However, it is voluntary. Again, this hasn't happened yet, but it would be on a voluntary basis and it would be done free of charge. It kind of reminds me of a similar policy that was taken, I think, a few years back by a Texas governor, in which he shipped those coming to the border at the U.S.-Mexico border, shipped them up north, either to D.C. or New York or a sanctuary city that was welcoming toward migrants. So it's somewhat of a similar policy. But of course, this has greatly upset Brussels. Now, remember that just after this June ruling was issued, or this penalty was implemented on Hungary, July was that time period when Orban was really upsetting and agitating the EU establishment when he met with Xi Jinping of China. He also met with Zelensky, Ukrainian president, and also Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was part of a wider peace mission. He got a lot of criticism for that. And many of the individuals who were critical of this stated that it was against EU policy to make negotiations with these leaders, even though he said they weren't official negotiations. But again, this is just one other thing that has really upset the establishment. But that's the problem with joining the EU. That's the problem with the EU, is you have to adhere to these policies that aren't necessarily very good for EU citizens and for the countries within this bloc. But they do benefit the West, that is the United States, I would say.
Yeah, well, the Schengen Agreement was one of the sort of crown jewels of the European Union.
Sure.
But of course, Berlin introduced temporary restrictions to visas in the wake of the Solingen knife attack, which was claimed by ISIS, whoever they are. And of course, with what's going on in Hungary, the fears are that the Schengen area could cease to function, undermined by a raft of uncoordinated border checks. Some people would say this was inevitable. The original idea of the Schengen was an egg, a hard shell exterior, but fluidity inside. But if that hard shell ceases to exist, then it's not surprising people are going to want to start to set up some barriers inside the gooey stuff. And that's what's happening. I mean, in many ways, I think Schengen, was great for European citizens. Absolutely, go from Italy to France to Spain or something, but it's been abused, hasn't it, by the Brussels globalists who opened the borders. It's as simple as that. That's where the problems stem from.
Sure. I think it makes travel a lot easier from within the EU. You always have to go through these extra hurdles if you're traveling from Europe, continental Europe, to the UK, to the United States, or outside. So yes, there are some conveniences to the Schengen policies, but I think the way that it's being framed now by the EU establishment, that they're so concerned about the security of the EU, of the Schengen zone, it comes just a little bit hollow. I do hope that they're sincere in what they are now stating. But what I've noticed is that specific leaders of various countries, like, for example, Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, is very upset about Germany's new restrictions to curb this irregular migration, probably because the two countries share a border and they're worried that they're going to have to take in some of these individuals. Also, the Interior Minister of Austria, I believe it was, stated that Austria will not take in any irregular migrants that Germany chooses not to take in. So when different countries, and they're allowed to do this under the Schengen border procedures or protocol, they are allowed to have their own policies within reason. However, it does sort of have a ripple effect on the neighboring countries that they may have to take in these migrants. So it does upset those nearby.
And at home there in Hungary, recent challenges to Orban's supremacy, but is he holding firm? Does he still enjoy the support of most Hungarians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always point back to, again, the recent election that they had in 2022, in which Orban won by a huge margin against a lot of strong opposition. When I say opposition, I mean funding of the opposition candidate from the United States, which I've spoken about, I think, quite a bit on the program. But now you do have the emergence of Peter Magyar. We spoke about that last time. His emergence to popularity is very interesting and complex, a little bit suspect as well. But he is now the leader of the TISA party. He seems to be gaining some favorability here because he is not taking the globalist approach, where some of the other opposition parties that haven't done so well here have taken a more globalist, pro-EU approach. It does seem that the TISA party, while they are not very clear on what their policy stances are, still takes a Hungary first approach. So he could very well be, that is Peter Magyar, a serious rival to the Orban government. So we'll have yet to see, I guess, in the coming years, the next time they have an election.
Is he simply a stalking horse, an American stooge, or is he a genuine? Go on.
You know, it's very interesting. I suspect that very well could be the case. The reason I say that is because it's been done before. And I know that doesn't sound like such strong evidence, but there were serious efforts to fund the opposition candidate. As I mentioned, in 2022, they actually set up a fund. Action for Democracy was receiving U.S. money that was then being sent to this Hungarian candidate, Peter Markizai. But he was too globalist, too left-wing for the Hungarian people to really resonate with him. So I think that given that Peter Magyar's rise to power is very suspect, he was formerly a close ally of the Fidesz party, which is the ruling government. Orban's party was formerly an ally with Orban. Now he broke out of that, except this time, as I mentioned, he's not going the globalist route. He's sticking with the Hungary first approach. I think it's very plausible that there could be some suspicious or nefarious activity going on with that, but I would have to dig a little bit deeper to see if there's any concrete evidence of that. But it's certainly something to keep on our radar and pay attention to.
Suspicious behavior by our politicians. Who knew?
Yes.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Taylor Hudak, thank you so much for joining us from Budapest, our Central Europe correspondent here on the Basil Valentine Show today. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, Mr. Cryptocurrency himself. Yes, Blake Lovewell. I thought Bitcoin was going to be on the slide. I'm seeing today $56,000 is on the horizon. I'll ask Blake what's caused the rally. I don't have any. Do you? We'll be right back. See you in a moment.
Basil Valentine on today's News Talk, TNT.